Welcome back to Writing Women, the show where I talk about the women who exist in fiction and the people who created them. I do it to myself. I don't know why I thought this was a good idea, but I did. It is Halloween season, so I thought this would be as good a time as any to revisit the House of Night series. For those of you who have read the House of Night series, I'm sure you already know what is coming. This week is going to be Betrayed, the second book in the House of Night series. This book has magic, it has vampires, it has a super inappropriate relationship between an adult teacher and a teenage student. What more could I ask for? I want to start by saying that I've tried really hard to like these books. I have a lot of friends who this is their ride or die series. I really wanted to enjoy them on the same level, but I just can't. I'll get into it more later, but there are the bones of a really great world here. It's just poisoned with a lot of useless meanness and racism from the mind of the author, projected through the mouth of a Native American teenage protagonist. I wrote a pretty detailed summary of the plot because I kept having to stop and make sure that I read something correctly. And I had to keep stopping to get my thoughts on a certain scene down immediately, or it would just leave my brain in my anger at the next scene. As a result, there is some commentary sprinkled throughout the summary, but there will be a longer commentary section at the end. I'm just going to go ahead and read my summary directly from my notes instead of trying to read it from a script, because there's a lot. Zoe and the other students prepare for Parents' Night. Her parents show up, and of course, her stepfather causes a scene. Neferet gives him the option to leave, and he does so, taking Zoe's mom with him. Zoe's grandma had come too, and has to go as they are her ride, but she promises to return and see Zoe again. Zoe leaves the hall to go for a walk, and comes upon Aphrodite and her parents arguing, so she hides in the bushes to eavesdrop. They are pissed that Aphrodite lost the leadership of the Dark Daughters, and want her to do whatever she can to get it back. Aphrodite herself seems to be resigned about losing her role, even telling them that Zoe deserves the position more than she did. Zoe scrambles away from them before they see her. She tells Stevie Ray about it, but her friend cautions her to not trust Aphrodite, even though Aphrodite kind of seems like she's a different person than what we thought she was in the first book. During class, Zoe goes to the library and researches other prep schools, particularly Kent, the one that Shawnee used to go to before she got marked. She has to reform the Dark Daughters and wants to model it more after traditional student organizations. She's interrupted by Lauren Blake, the first male poet laureate in 200 years, who sits with her and gets a little too close for an adult man talking to a teenage girl. Zoe brings her new plan to her friends, and then to Neferet, but Neferet is haranguing Aphrodite in her office. Zoe listens to Aphrodite get yelled at before creeping away. Now, here's one of my first notes. All Zoe seems to do to find out information is overhear people. She doesn't necessarily seem to, find a lot of information on her own. She just seems to, happen upon people who are already talking and, follow them and eavesdrop. She doesn't, seek out this information. It just kind of, happens to her. Lenobia, the horse mistress, has taken a liking to Zoe, and after seeing Zoe relax during lessons, she offers to be a listening, sympathetic ear for her. This won't come back later, by the way. We won't see Lenobia again at all in this book. This book is so bad. Zoe walks along the school wall and has another highly inappropriate interaction with her adult man of a teacher. Zoe goes to spill the beans to Stevie Ray, but she's watching the news with the twins. They call Zoe over, and she sees that a kid she used to know has gone missing. Here we get another of those stellar adult pretending to be a teen lectures on the horrors of alcohol and nastiness of pot. All Zoe's new, beautiful, and perfect vamp friends agree that only gross, nasty losers smoke the devil's lettuce. They legit go on forever about how it's ugly and bad because it makes you eat for no reason. Stevie Ray begins to actually show anger at Zoe's pity for Aphrodite now. At the same time, we're finally getting a little bit more characterization of the other friends. Well, two of them anyway. The twins. We're getting to know more about them other than they're white and black but considered twins. Damien is still just the gay one. The tension of Neferet's true nature is weird. I can't tell if it's well done or not. It almost seems too obvious. Zoe finds a haiku taped inside her locker and assumes that it is from Lauren. She finally gets to tell Stevie Ray about all this, but does so in the worst narrative way possible. They just repeat each interaction that we, the reader, have already seen in depth. This time, we have Stevie Ray's commentary, though. So we literally just reread the exact same interactions we have already read, with just slight interjections of Stevie Ray going, "No way! Shut up, really?" And it's so irritating. So now the first missing human teen has shown up dead, and another teenager has gone missing. Zoe finds Aphrodite having another vision, but this time it's a little more personal. The vision is of Zoe's grandmother dying when a bridge collapses while she's driving over it with her car. Aphrodite makes Zoe swear an oath to owe her a favor before giving her the details. She also refuses to go to Neferet and makes Zoe swear not to tell her. This oath to owe her a favor is not mentioned again in this book. I actually completely forgot that she had sworn this oath before Aphrodite would tell her about this vision. After the exchange, Aphrodite leaves and Zoe calls to warn her grandma before figuring out how to stop the rest of the disaster with her friend's input. She settles on making a bomb threat on the bridge. Shush. No. No. Some detectives show up to question Zoe because of her rather hostile interactions with her human ex and human friend who she threatened to get them to leave the House of Night in the first book. Since she knew the missing dead teens and the dead boy was found mauled, there is obvious suspicion on the House of Night. The detectives want to talk to Lauren Blake as well, but Neferet lies and says that he left the school the day before. Zoe tells her friends everything before having a kind of funny scene about counting sheep to try and fall asleep, and then has a meaningful dream. She wakes around dawn and covers her fledgling tattoos with makeup so she can go outside of the school grounds. We get a little bit of pretty neat world building about how humans don't think that fledglings leave the school, but they really do. They just use this special makeup to cover up their marks, and it's really cool. It's pretty neat. Cool stuff to learn about. She wanders to a mall and does some shopping, name-dropping stores and the Starbucks she sits at constantly, and runs into her human ex-boyfriend, Heath. Oh, Heath. Turns out he's not gross and clean and sober now. They have a very boring conversation about their relationship and how he wants her back. She's kind of mean to him a few times. I really don't understand the obsession with her. This isn't some Bella Swan rude internal monologue where she looks at somebody and is just like, that person smells kind of bad. It's like she actually sits down next to the person, looks at them, and says out loud to their face, "Wow, you smell disgusting. You should take a shower, you fat pig." Like that's who she is as a person. She says that out loud to people. Like that's not an internal thought, that's an external one. And then in this world, that person then turns and looks at her and says, "Wow, I love you so much. Can we be best friends?" And I just don't get it. Zoe is almost exclusively a shitty person out loud, and in any sane world, nobody would want to be friends with her. There are, however, a lot of good insights here about how covering her mark to try and capture some of her old life has led to reinforcing her love of her new life. It is a shame that it's buried under so much meanness, dated brand name dropping with her American Eagle bag, and weird stuff like mentioning how Heath's friends call him a pussy whipped dork. Is Heath supposed to be endearing? Because he just reads as annoying and pushy to me. Like, he constantly explains to Zoe how she's wrong about everything and ignores what she wants out of situations and just completely disrespects her wishes and just tells her that she's wrong and he's right and just pushes past her no on everything, which leads to when he follows her to her car, gets into her car, and forces her to drink his blood, which is a scene that reads pretty clearly as rape. He coerces her to do it, cuts himself, and just pushes past her no. I will talk more about that later on, but I just needed to clearly outline that scene very, very, very clearly reads as a rape scene. But the way it is written is as kind of a hot romantic scene. Zoe sneaks back to make her bomb threat call, and here we get some pretty open anti-Muslim sentiment. The terrorist group she and her friends made up is called Nature's Jihad. It's basically exactly what I expect a terrorist group to be named, from a middle-aged, kind of racist white woman from Oklahoma at the end of the Bush era. It's just so wild that they would call it that when it's like a secular eco-terrorist, like domestic terrorist group. It's not even a religious terrorist group. They're eco-terrorists. I don't get it. Why would you call it Nature's Jihad? Zoe tells Stevie Ray about meeting Heath before they go to join their friends to watch the news. Zoe sees Aphrodite, who kind of gives her a little nod to acknowledge her plan to close the bridge. All of Zoe's friends go in on Aphrodite, and she bites back at them. Zoe tries to peacekeep, and afterwards, Zoe tries to explain to her friends that she feels bad for Aphrodite, and Stevie Ray says my favorite example of cognitive dissonance I think I've ever seen in any book ever. They're all talking about how Aphrodite is too old to be blaming her behavior on her messed up parents, which for the record is a really damaging idea. People deal with childhood trauma their whole lives. Then this girl has the absolute nerve to say, Zoe's parents didn't affect her, so Aphrodite has no excuse. 1. People deal with trauma differently. This can be pretty easily observed by looking at kids who grew up in the same abusive household. 2. Again, there's no such thing as being too old to process the trauma that you received in childhood. 3. Zoe is a terrible person. She is just their friend, so they justify their own shitty behavior and hers is right because they can't see their own actions as negative even when they act very similar to the people they place in the wrong category. This is what I would call irresponsible as hell, and also really reinforces my belief that the author hates teenagers and thinks that they are all awful. Anyway, they go to prep everything for the full moon ritual, and it starts to snow. Neferret introduces a new student to Zoe and her friends. They hear on the news that the bomb hoax has worked. It was uncovered, but there were no suspects, so obviously Zoe and her friends are safe. They also see that the barge captain who would have crashed into the bridge had a heart attack. The presence of emergency personnel for the bomb threat actually saved his life. They finish setting up everything for the full moon ritual, and they all head toward dinner, this time with new additions like the new kid and one of the school's jock types who seem to be into Stevie Ray. Zoe breaks off from them as they start a snowball fight and goes to the media center to further work on her ritual. Here we get more choice shaming of Aphrodite as a slut, despite Zoe's own behavior in this entire book. Lest we forget, it's evil to want sex at all, unless you are the main character. Then it's okay so long as you feel intense shame about it. Though this does lead to her wanting to talk to Aphrodite about her bloodlust. She finds another haiku and spirals into crisis mode trying to figure out if it's from Lauren and meant romantically or maybe from Aphrodite and letting her know that Aphrodite knows her secrets. Zoe walks outside in the blizzard to get supplies for her ritual and spots a mysterious figure. She follows it and comes upon a meeting between it and Neferret. The figure is Elliot, the kid who is supposed to be dead and whose ghost has attacked Zoe once already. They are near the trap door the previous attack happened by. Neferret is saying weird stuff to Elliot, and Zoe is a little bit confused about what that means. Elliot refers to Neferret as goddess, and she allows him to drink her blood. Zoe is kind of horrified by this and flees. She tries to confide in her friends, but realizes that she can't really tell them everything. Neferret has strong intuition, and may sense that they know something about her, so they can't really go running around the school knowing this secret. She instead tells them that she saw Elliot's ghost and leaves it at that. She goes to her room, joined by Stevie Ray, who has a headache, and starts to research advanced bloodlust and imprinting. There's a lot of good lore here. Stuff about how it works, how the ecstasy of feeding likely is a big part of humans' fear of vampires. She reads about how fledglings can't imprint on each other, so blood drinking among fledglings is encouraged, but it's discouraged among adult vampires and fledglings because that can form like a really strong imprint bond. All of this makes her think of Heath, so when she stops reading, she winds up projecting herself through their bond into his room and watches him masturbate, which completely disregards like all consent there. It's an interesting thought. She comes back to herself and texts him to set up a meeting later that week. When she finally falls asleep, she winds up sleeping for 12 hours, nearly missing performance of the recently returned Shakespearean competition contestants, including her actual boyfriend, Eric Knight. She and Stevie Ray both overslept, and Stevie Ray is looking a little bit sick. Eric won the competition, of course, with a monologue from Othello. He gives Zoe a gift, and she goes to set up the full moon ritual. During this time, her friends, including Damien, discover newfound affinities for the elements, which is uncommon for males to have affinities for the elements. Neferet congratulates them on all of this before announcing to the gathered students the new changes being made to the Dark Daughters. However, she takes credit for the changes that Zoe had decided to make. Now, we have a lot of extended thought processes from Zoe in this segment about how some people accept Damien and some people don't, and how some people call him slurs. I'm not going to say those slurs here, but they are present in the book frequently, actually. And that's a point that I wanted to make, where Cast uses these slurs constantly. And yes, the framing of them being used is often in the context of Zoe saying, wow, isn't it so sad that these bad people will call Damien a blank and a blank, but I would never do that because I'm his friend and I accept him. Alone, like if it was just that, it probably wouldn't really jump out at me. But with Cast's other use of slurs, with how she talks about black people, with how she talks about mentally impaired people, with how she her cavalier use of the R slur just kind of tells me that she's really comfortable using those slurs, and it kind of feels like maybe she feels like she's getting away with something when she's just sitting there behind her keyboard, like typing those things out, like, I can't get away with using these slurs in real life, so I'm going to type them up in my book. But it's okay because I'm saying that it's bad to say those things. Zoe's starting to realize that there's something really wrong going on with Neferet, but she knows that nobody will believe her. Lauren shows up to assist with the ritual. He offers to do the poetry reading and intro for Zoe, the way he does for Neferet's rituals. She accepts and is flustered by his presence, but nobody else seems to think that anything is weird. They perform the ritual, and it's a great success. Afterward, while they're doing cement handprints for the new prefects, Stevie Ray starts coughing badly, her body starts rejecting the change in front of everyone, and she starts spewing blood everywhere. They bring her the earth candle for which she has an affinity, and Zoe speaks a blessing over her. Neferet comes and has them bring the girl to the infirmary to die. Stevie Ray dies in Zoe's arms, and Neferet sends the kids back to the dorms while she cares for the body. Aphrodite stops to give her condolences, and the twins are needlessly cruel to her. Zoe talks to her privately about their mutual ability to sense bad things, and Aphrodite tries to comfort Zoe. She tells her that Nyx didn't warn her because there was nothing that she could do. Zoe tries to lash out at her, but Aphrodite simply tells her that Neferet lies and not to drink whatever the priestess gave Zoe before leaving. The group brings Zoe to her room and leaves so she can shower and change before returning with food. They have a brief morning session for Stevie Ray, where they laugh and cry and talk about their friend, and then Zoe sneakily dumps Neferet's potion down the drain. Once they leave, she talks to her grandma on the phone and decides she won't ignore Stevie Ray's death the way older vamps seem to want fledglings to. Zoe's friends wind up joining her to sleep so that they can all be together this first night without Stevie Ray. The whole section from the moment Aphrodite and Zoe talk until Zoe and her remaining friends actually fall asleep is the best in the book. There's still the hint of romance when she texts Heath. There's the animosity of Neferet's existence. And it does the work of showing the difficulty that comes with the death of a loved one. It shows moment by moment how they try to remember her fondly, but it's tainted by the guilt and sadness of being there while their friend is gone. And it's completely, well, almost completely, unspoiled by some of the unnecessary meanness and hate that is constantly coming out of Zoe's mind. Zoe dreams of the ghost fledglings. Stevie Ray is now one of them. She's making power moves on Elliot. Neferet has placed her in charge of the Revenants because she has an affinity for one of the elements. Heath shows up and the dead fledglings grab him. Zoe wakes up late to find the school snowed in and closed for the day. She joins her friends and Eric for a Star Wars marathon just in time to catch the news of Heath's disappearance. Zoe goes to Aphrodite immediately to ask her about visions. She also learns about the potion Neferet tried to give her. It would have made her apathetic and forgetful about Stevie Ray, and Aphrodite assumed that Zoe would want to remember her best friend the way Aphrodite had to force herself to remember her own former best friend, Venus, after she took the potion when Venus died. The detectives are back to talk to Zoe. Neferet sits in on the interview and tries to stop Zoe from sharing any info. Zoe tells them about her dream vision and thinks that she can trust at least one of the detectives, Detective Marks, because his twin sister is actually a vampire. They leave to check Zoe's alibi with Shawnee and Aaron, and Neferet tries to pry info out of Zoe. She's acting suspicious openly now, and Zoe is starting to see parallels with her own mother's behavior. Specifically the betrayal part. Zoe goes to groom her horse, and Eric accompanies her. She comes clean to him about everything with Heath, and instead of breaking up with her, he suggests that she use her imprint bond to find him. She tries unsuccessfully at first, and then finally reaches him. He's in some old tunnels somewhere under Tulsa, being held captive and fed on. He reveals the faces of his captors, all fledglings who are supposed to be dead, including Stevie Ray. Heath tries to hold back his location because Zoe won't call the cops, but she convinces him to give it up. When Zoe comes back to her body, she's greeted by Aphrodite. The other girl helps her saddle her horse and explains how she'd had visions of the undead fledglings, and that's when Neferet started saying that her visions were false. Zoe actually apologizes for snapping at Aphrodite and calls Shawnee to tell her friends to gather and call their elements to send them to help her on her journey. She journeys out into the still raging snowstorm to go rescue Heath. She arrives at the building Heath guided her to and delves beneath it into the tunnels. When she reaches Heath, she has to burst through a crowd of the undead creatures. She calls fire to her hands and tries to break free, but Stevie Ray arrives. She explains to Zoe that she's changed now. Zoe tries to hug her, but Stevie Ray doesn't really react. She tells Zoe to never touch her again. Zoe thinks that she still sees something of the old Stevie Ray in this thing's eyes. While it hesitates, the others, namely Elliot and Aphrodite's former roommate Venus, try to step up to kill Zoe and Heath. Stevie Ray calls them off, and Zoe tries to talk to Stevie Ray. She also has some banter with Heath over whether or not they are broken up. It's a great time for this. Zoe tries to appeal to Stevie Ray's humanity, but it doesn't seem to work. She orders the kill and leaves her underlings to it. Heath tries to help fight, but he's pretty clearly outmatched. Zoe calls her elements again and starts slinging fire. She senses her friends, sending their support to her. The creatures stand back a bit, but they still follow while Zoe and Heath escape. Zoe calls the earth to close the tunnels behind them, and she sees a vision of Stevie Ray in her undead form weeping on the floor of one of the tunnels. After the collapse, they can flee properly. Heath offers his blood to Zoe for her strength, and they are interrupted by Stevie Ray. She wants Zoe to kill her. Zoe talks her down a bit, but just as they make progress, Stevie Ray senses Neferet's approach. Zoe and Heath have to flee before they are seen. Zoe promises to come back for Stevie Ray. Once they get back to the basement tunnel access, Zoe calls the detective she had decided to trust. They think they made it, but of course Neferet finds them. Zoe tries to play it like she's happy to see the priestess. Neferet has to make a snap decision and erases Zoe and Heath's memories. Zoe has a dream of Nyx again. The goddess reminds her that the elements can restore, then she wakes up. Detective Marks helps Zoe back to the House of Night. Heath is taken in an ambulance back to a human hospital. Neferet is gone, of course. The police are caring for Persephone till the road's clear. Detective Marks tries to ask Zoe what happened, but she can't remember. She confesses to him that something is wrong. She tries to work backward with him to figure out the events of the night. Marks' knowledge of vampires tells him that this memory issue is probably resulting from a high priestess meddling with Zoe's mind. Zoe tries to drift through her memories, and they finally start coming back. They stop the car so that she can be sick. She calls the elements to her, and she remembers everything. She tells the detective a lie, but he kind of knows that it isn't true. She returns to her friends, and they are all happy to see her. Neferet is there to greet her and is all smiles. Zoe shows all of them that her mark has spread further down her back now. Zoe tells Neferet that she's going to Nyx's temple to give thanks and to light a candle for Stevie Ray. She embraces the priestess to basically give her an I know what you are message, but there's no mention at all of how the priestess reacts. There's absolutely no mention of how Neferet responds to this message. She just says the message, and then they're on their way out of the building. Zoe and her friends light a candle and place it at the feet of Nyx's statue, and the book ends. So this book is just kind of weird. For how anti-sex and slut-shamey it is, it certainly reads more like erotica than any other genre. Which would be fine if it weren't for how shameful sexual urges are implied to be in it. I don't think it's going out on a limb to say that most vampire or vampire-adjacent media is inherently a little bit erotic, what with all the penetration. It does go back to a point I made in my video for Marked, though. When the narrative constantly derails for the supporting cast, or the narrator herself to go off about how slutty and disgusting or shameful other people, or themselves in Zoe's case are, for engaging in sexual activity or thoughts. That and the weird after-school special style finger-wagging at people who smoke or drink make it really hard to see this as a teenage narrator, because it reads so much more like an adult who is being judgmental of teens. I am so torn on this series because there are so many long stretches of great world building where I get so into it. I will start to see why this series has gone on so long and why so many people will talk about it like it's really good. We'll be at the full moon ritual, or we will be at that long section after Stevie Ray's death, and I'll be thinking, wow, this is so interesting. This is a world that I really want to learn more about. These are characters that I really want to find out more about. And then it will all come crashing down when there's an extended section about what a slutty bitch Aphrodite is. It's like Cast can't go too long without reminding the reader that these are teenagers. And as we all know, teenagers are shallow, catty, and mean. I want to write fan fiction for this that's going to be like House of Night, but less problematic. So each chapter would be Betrayed, Chapter 1, but without the ableism and slut-shaming. This book is from 2007, so it is definitely a relic of its time with some of the references. At least Zoe shopped for a new bag from American Eagle because, as we all know, Abercrombie is for preps, and only, the super weird kids go to Hot Topic. I did get really tired of the black characters' skin color being constantly described as different types of food, which of course is something that's rarely, if ever, used as a descriptor for the white characters. I think writers think that they're being complimentary when they're saying something like, her skin was as dark as chocolate, but it comes off as more fetishizing when they are the only characters described that way. Along those same lines, I don't think I've ever read something that has so thoroughly tokenized its own characters. Poor Damien isn't even a real character. He's a walking caricature of the gay best friend. Everything he does gaily. And his friends make it a point to stop and mention constantly how absolutely, completely, totally gay he is. He loves dick, we get it. But he's still a virgin, because as we all know, sex is bad. Though I would love to know more about him than that, and his one quirk about being a vocabulary snob. Back on the subject of Heath. Heath is not endearing, he's not sweet, he's not a gentleman, he's kind of rapey, and a huge douche. He's the college frat guy who has multiple sexual encounters that feature dubious consent, and who doesn't understand why women talk about rape culture. Zoe flat out tells the reader that Heath is a homophobe when talking about how Eric reacts to Damien, and comparing it to how Heath would have reacted to Damien. As I've already mentioned, he forces his blood on Zoe in a scene that very, very clearly reads as sexual assault. But don't worry, it turns out Zoe was really into it. Heath just had to push past her initial protest because, like, she didn't realize that she wanted it. He just, like, had to keep pushing past those no's until she finally said yes. And this whole story culminates in Zoe saying that she loves him in the tunnels when they're having their weird banter, or when they're, like, surrounded by the undead fledglings. And Zoe turns and is just like, I love you. And don't even get me started on the multiple boyfriends and the slut-shaming thing, because I feel like that's going to come up a lot more in the future books. Now, Zoe is a chosen one, and I'm not as bothered by this as a lot of other people who review this book, like on Goodreads and on other places that I've seen online, seem to be. She is a super special, awesome character, but that kind of comes with the territory of being a chosen one. I do wish that some of her specialness came from her own choices and intelligence than from, her goddess-given powers and her, intuition that comes from the goddess telling her to do things. It seems like every decision that she has to make, she gets that gut feeling that's the goddess telling her, like, hey, do this. Or she gets a literal dream visit from the goddess telling her, like, hey, maybe you should do this, instead of her figuring out on her own. And that does bother me a little bit. That's all I've got for Betrayed. I want to stop talking about this book right now. I have such a headache talking about it. I do have some good news, though. I am going to be featuring on my friend's podcast, Up Fables. I'm going to be leaving a link down below to their channel. That episode that I feature on is probably going to be coming out sometime in the next couple weeks. But it's a really funny show. I highly recommend giving it a listen. They are really funny over there. They just talk about the kind of fucked up history behind a lot of fables that get kind of watered down, and maybe you've heard the watered down version but you don't know, like, the real story behind it, that kind of thing. Now, I am going straight into the next House of Night book, so maybe I will get more of those long stretches of lore and world building and less of the meanness and racism and ableism and slut-shaming. I can only hope. If you like this video, go ahead and like the video. If you want to see more from me, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. And if you want to see some behind-the-scenes content, head on over to my Patreon, patreon.com/writingwomen, where I post some content a little bit early and some behind-the-scenes content. Thank you to my current patrons, Mariodoc Brandybuck, Ms. Psycho, Amy Chu, aka The Doctor, Lord Butterbutt, and Bruce. Zoe flat out tells the reader that Heath is a homophobe when comparing how... Hey!